I talk about resilience often, right? Because I don't know that you can synthetically create, you can come up with a case study. I mean, you can get tastes of it, right? But I don't think you understand it unless you've been through some trials and tribulations, right? So the downfall of that, I wish I would have realized this much earlier, is that resilience can also on the spectrum become hard-headedness, stubborn, unwilling to listen, to not be flexible. And so you have to really, have not only mentors, I think is extremely important. You have to have other sources beyond just the professional environment that you're in that will give you different perspectives. I would compare it to like driving on the road. Sometimes, there are road signs that are helpful to give you, this is coming. Sometimes there are billboards that are just distracting information. And you got to have some type of between mentors and what I would consider a lifelong intellectual curiosity of learning that keeps you on the road, right? Those are your hands that keeps you on the road. So when you see a billboard, it's a billboard that's not it's useless. Or is this saying there's a warning sign coming up that maybe you can anticipate? But resilience is one of those things I'd be careful of because what got you here, whatever it is, versus where you want to be, those can be some different requirements.
I'm Brandon Smith, and I'm your host on this week's edition of the Leadership Foundry podcast. Our guest is Robert Sawyer. He is a partner at Sikich. Sikich is a global consulting firm specializing in technology-enabled professional services. I love Robert's story. I love our conversation here today. What I love about it is Robert's really had two careers. He spent his first career in the United States Marine Corps. And so he gets to talk about his leadership lessons from the Marine Corps and that season of his life. And then he pivoted into the corporate space and he became ultimately a partner in an IT consulting firm. And he gets to share his learnings there. So I really want you to not only pay attention to Robert's story, but really listen to the story of resilience, which underpins all of it and some of the ways he navigated through those transitions. Of course, I take plenty of notes, so stay tuned to the very end and I'll share some of my highlights.
Welding together practical insights and powerful conversations to forge world-class leaders. This is the Leadership Foundry podcast.
Robert, really excited to have you on the show, my friend. Excited to hear you talk about your leadership lessons and your journey. And you and I have gotten a chance to get to know each other the last few years, and I just loved your story and journey. But of course, the listeners here, they don't know it. So before we jump into leadership lessons, which is kind of the meat of our show today, I would love for you to spend a few moments just talking a little bit about your career journey. Well, what ultimately were the seats you sat in that got you to the seat you're sitting in today?
So try not to be long drawn out about the story is interesting because if you look back, and I know it's kind of self-promoting to say it's interesting, but if I look back, all the dots seem to have a purpose and connect.
Yeah.
At the time, I can't say it was with clarity that I knew where the next steps were coming, but I did have moments where I think certain convictions or groundings started pushing me in one direction or the other.
Yeah, totally.
So I won't go so far back to just a little glimpse of high school is that's where failure began and kind of the pride before the fall because I was voted most athletic in my high school. I was, all Northwest Florida, which means nothing, but to an 18-year-old
This
kid.
is why you keep crushing Meat Orange Theory. I've been wondering. Now I know. I've been going up against an athlete. See, this isn't fair. I wish I had known this.
Well, it was a short-lived, if you want to call it even a career. There was visions of grandeur, and then there was the reality. And, I thought I was going to go on to do more athletic things. The reality is all district and all Northwest Florida means nothing in the grand scheme of things of Division I football. And, oh, by the way, there's this thing called GPA that I thought, what used to be called Proposition 48, I would just find a way. Well, that's only reserved for probably NFL prospects to get them into that first year of school.
Yeah.
So I was completely embarrassed by not having that kind of next wow factor, I'd say braggingly. So of all things, I chose the Marines, which is just odd because I had a very strange problem with authority. Like, I just didn't work with it. I didn't work well. And but I knew I had to kind of put myself through some kind of rigor to recalibrate. And I didn't take it seriously. I missed every kind of pre-function, preparation. I thought, man, if I could figure out my way out of this, I would. But the internet wasn't around, thank goodness. So I didn't know that there was an out. I was raised by my grandparents, and they told me, you're going to go to jail if you don't go to boot camp. And I'm like, my God, what have I done? So, but then I got there, and I decided to take it seriously on the bus ride into Paris Island, and everybody's excited. I'm thinking, man, this is the wrong fit. And then they started yelling and screaming. I was like, okay, well, I guess it's time to get serious now. And then I realized that if I did things faster, I got yelled and screamed at less. I was like, well, this is kind of working. And but then that's where leadership started to kick in, because then there was these other things called guides and squad leaders, which I didn't understand because I had no interest in the military growing up. And so I'm learning things on the fly, but just how do I not get yelled and screamed at?
Yeah.
Then next thing you know, I get promoted to squad leader, which means now I'm paying for everybody else's mistakes. And I'm like, this is not what I envisioned. Why am I getting punished for somebody else's mistake? Then I got promoted to guide. And all of this was to avoid what I thought was getting yelled and screamed at, but more and more responsibility at that point started to be forced on me. And so I was never able to think of myself. It was always go last, be first, set the example, and if you're not effective, that's your responsibility. The buck stops there. So, from there it was, I had different direction about what particular technical skill. I did well on the military test, but I still didn't have any interest of any particular career. It was just kind of a passing item. The Marine Corps is funny, you have what they call hopes and dreams of where you want to go, and then there's where you end up. And my entire career was opposite of everything I've wanted. So if you want to talk about a 20-year test of resilience, it was everything I wanted to do, I ended up going in the opposite direction.
So what's an example of that? What was something that you say early on, I wanted to do this, and they ended up saying, well, we're going to actually send you over here?
Yeah, so, first I wanted to go to Pensacola, which is this, when you're younger, you just want to get back home, right? So, signals intelligence. I didn't care what the title was. I just knew that there was a school in Pensacola. And they sent me to Virginia to ground intelligence and analyst. I'm like, this is not Pensacola, right? And we get a week from graduation, and again, I'm not filtered about like bureaucracy and politics. They ask me a question, I tell them unfiltered answers. They say, do you really want to be an intel? I'm like, no, I do not. And they said, well, what do you want to be? I was infantry. And of course, I'm glad they didn't listen, because then they sent me to communications school. And I'm like, this is not working out. And then at least at the end of communications school, I thought like, well, at least I'll go to North Carolina, right? I don't want to go overseas. And where did I get sent? I got sent overseas, right? And I had no desire to travel outside the United States. And again, as part of the journey, right, I ended up meeting my wife that first year, and we dated for years, but...
And so where overseas was that first assignment?
Okinawa, Japan.
That was Okinawa,
which my only frame of reference, again, this is pre-internet, was Black Rain, which was like the Japanese Yakuza, mafia story, and Karate Kid. So these are all stereotypes I'm believing have more touches of reality than what we know nowadays, right?
Right.
So I get there the first time, and I'm hearing motorcycles. I'm like, man, they're going to cut our heads off. It's just believing all these extremes of an 18, 19-year-old. But then I ended up, again, I didn't want to be there, and it became a blessing in disguise because I ended up meeting my wife. Fast forward a couple of years, we ended up getting married, and I was still very young, but again, that was my other grounding that gave me purpose, where again, I'm not thinking of myself at this point. And I said, well, I guess it's time for me to get serious. And then the interesting part of, I went straight into the military after high school, but the interesting part about it is I just didn't have a desire. I was smart enough, but I didn't have a desire to go to college to learn. I wanted to just play, right? But her parents, as a stipulation of marriage, was, we want you to go to university and learn our language and culture. So I can follow rules and suggestions. So I did that. And then I started taking all these other courses that I didn't want, because that's how you have to get to. And University of Maryland had a satellite campus where they brought professors over there to teach.
Wow.
So I'm in the classroom and I'm just kind of going through a check in the box, but then I start finding all these other interests. And it was, again, serendipity, if you will, or pragmatic reasons. But then I started to get really interested in everything academia, right? So fast forward, I got my associates, then I got my bachelor's, and then I felt like it was never an adequate amount. So I kept, along with my career, along with being married, I had my first child when I was like 21, my second around 24, and I think I've got the world figured out at that point. But I still, again, I'm going through all the academics part, got into grad school, completed a couple of grad degrees, and then got into analytics.
And what were those graduate degrees in?
MBA, and then master's degree in business intelligence. And it allowed me a lot of opportunities, because again, I think it doesn't matter how much you know. It matters initially of whether or not can you effectively communicate, can you somewhat draw people into the story of the reason why they want to pay attention, and can you articulate it in a way that makes sense for who your audience is at that point. And I was able to do that, and it just opened doors of connecting me to, military is interesting in that there's the standard format of how you go through a career, and then there are other doors that get opened by just networking. Even in the military, it's not a concrete path. So I was able to kind of elevate myself out of being an enlisted person, and I never confused myself with being an officer. I didn't really have a desire at that point to become one, but I was able to be in closed-door conversations that I shouldn't have been quite often, and advise, and I didn't really care about the credit, and I think I can't remember exactly if it was maybe Truman, I think. I could be wrong, but it's amazing what you can accomplish if you don't worry about who gets the credit. And at that point, I just wasn't used to seeking credit, just more the outcome. But the interesting thing about it is when you don't come across as self-serving, yet you're still ambitious, then there's always a place for you somewhere, right? And then, I always had a desire. I never thought I would make the Marine Corps a career, but it just kind of kept turning out that way. There is something to be said about, I'm glad that I retired, because there are benefits and there's the tangibles, but I don't think I was ready. And then I started networking again, because LinkedIn was brand new. There was a lot of curiosity there, and it used to be not as guarded as it is now, where even Twitter, when it first came out, you could actually make direct contact with people that there would be no way, shape, or form, if you weren't within a social circle or professional network, that you would ever be able to contact these people. And I just learned early on, if you showed an interest in someone, that they would, and you use the word help, and it's genuine. I was curious, how were you successful? Are there repeatable patterns? Is there framework? And I was very curious about, not shortcutting the journey, but just wanting to learn. So I wanted to get into here again, this is kind of my journey about like, here's what I wanted, here's what life ended up with, right? Yeah. I wanted to get in investment banking. I had made contact with someone that was a former Marine. He was in a boutique shop, and I was like, I bought my suits in advance. I was there, I had an in, I was ready to, and again, I had probably romanticized the industry. I was thinking this is going to be a cross between, not that I wanted to be Gordon Gekko, but Wall Street there and Trading Places, somewhere between chaos, excitement, and all kind of the spectrum. And I just, again, not knowing, the realities of what that, I'm thankful enough my prayers weren't answered in that direction, but it's where I wanted to go. Started buying all my suits, getting prepared, and then the world melted, and then he's unemployed. And then I started thinking, man, there's a lot of volatility, going from where I'm at to now. And I always had just this thought in my mind that drove me, probably more, I'd say, borderline so focused, neurotic. Maybe that's not the best description, but I never wanted to go home and say, I don't know how we're going to make it. I don't know how I'm going to put food on the table. So that just drove me to such a degree that, consulting happened to be kind of one of those. There was this, again, former Marines, just, by curiosity, I started asking about this one company. CEO graduated where I got my MBA from. One of their service leaders actually was in the Marine Corps before, so it's just these random associations that you think doesn't matter. It gives somebody a little bit of curiosity about you to have maybe a conversation. And then, it's up to you. Once you get into that room, can you, I would say, present yourself in a way that not only sparks interest, but they see value. Like, okay, I see propensity, I see aptitude, I see growth. And there was a lot of experience. But again, the one part, and I was listening, there was a podcast the other day with Tony Gonzalez and Ryan Holiday on, let's say, is the Daily Stoic, and he was talking about the depression that some people go through when they go through this professional career and they don't realize that they're going to have to start over at some point in time.
Yeah.
And they're not going to be a master of their next endeavor, whatever it is, and that you just can't show up and think that you're going to be all pro, and that kind of resetting in life can be harsh. And I was surprised. I thought, all these years that I had prepared, that I was just going to be ready to hit the ground running. And on the surface, I probably was, but I would say there was a lot of, just reflection and tugging of war going through my mind about, life is not moving fast enough.
Yeah.
The world isn't moving fast enough. What am I doing wrong? And just not being, okay with the progress that life will take you sometimes.
Yeah.
And I just battled through it. I mean, I would say you can white knuckle some things through life, and, ambition and hard work. And, if I didn't know where I was going, at least I knew how to work hard. And I realized that maybe I didn't have all of the exact vernacular. Maybe I didn't understand all of the technology to a certain degree. I certainly had been involved in technology in the Marine Corps, but it's different. But I learned how to read and understand people. I learned how to listen, kind of what the language of needs are. And I noticed by looking at people that quite often people end up talking at each other. They're listening to respond, and they're not listening to understand. And it's just circular talk. And it would drive me crazy because I couldn't stand being, it's not that there's inefficient conversations. Sometimes you have to go through a dance. But there is just, it's like, man, we are not accomplishing anything. This is, confusing activity with results. We're having a meeting. Great. What accomplished? Well, I don't know. We talked about some stuff. Well, what come out of that? Well, we're going to circle back. I'm like, oh my God, please. Just coming up with, like I said, framework and acronyms, because I couldn't take people through the journey. Well, how do you see things like that? And it's like, well, I just like you to consider the next time you're in this meeting, there's 3 letters I want you to consider, PFC. Are you going to be a participant? Are you going to be a facilitator? Or are you going to contribute? And sometimes you have to go through all, but you have to recognize your role in that conversation and understand it's not what you have to say that's most important. It's how you're aligning to the client and having them understand how your value aligns with what their objectives and vision is. And they may not even have clarity on where they're going, but they want to understand, one, they're being heard, and that you're shepherding them along the way. And I think you might have made reference to it. It's a yes and.
Yeah.
It's not, again, confusion over vernacular. It's, I see your point, and I certainly understand where we could include that as part of scope, but I'd like you to consider. So there's just a lot of different ways, but it takes a lot of practice. And I would say in my industry, people become very technologically focused, and they sometimes lose the human centricity of things.
Yeah. So then you went through, and you've been in consulting then for how long at this point?
Going on 12 years.
Going on 12 years.
Yeah.
And what's your title now?
So I'm a partner, which is, I work at a consulting firm based out of Chicago, and it's audit, tax, and accounting, advisory, and technology. And so we're a Microsoft partner. I'm a partner at a Microsoft partner. It's like, man, there's a lot of titles, right? But I'm actually part of an equity ownership. And so when I say skin in the game, it's like literally there's there's skin in the game,
Yeah,
right? So,
nice. Beautiful. Excellent. Robert, awesome story. So if you were to highlight, what's maybe one or two points along your journey that you would say, gosh, that was a really fundamental leadership lesson, like that you learned that you said, wow, I need to start making these adjustments or show up differently if I want to be effective?
What I think is, kind of taking an honest evaluation of what you don't know, but not letting that be something that you're afraid of. And a lot of times you can end up buying time. When I say buying time, it doesn't mean that you're trying to come up with fluffy words to just sound important. It just means you can buy a lot of time if you spend a lot of time preparing. And I think, again, if you don't have good time management skills, you're not organized, you don't have a focus on there's an objective on why I'm going in this meeting to begin with. Maybe it's not a tangible objective, but you got to hopefully want to accomplish something. And how can I get us there the most efficient way possible without being transactional? So I just learned reading. I know it sounds, the old-fashioned due diligence, but Google, LinkedIn, any kind of SEC publications, anything that would help me ask more skillful questions. Because a lot of times, again, what I initially observed in some of the introductions, the kickoffs, is that they were too much of a brag board about what our company does, but that really doesn't mean anything until they understand, well, what does it mean to me? And so I learned that if you just learn how to ask more skillful, powerful questions without feeling self-important in asking them, that it draws a lot of people into the conversation because they see that you asking a certain level of question makes people reveal more information. And that's where the solution is. To me, the technology is just a utility. It's just a vehicle. It's not the answer. And then when you can connect, right, because a lot of the software out there has been more engineer-centric than human-oriented. So in that translation, I would say for that professional translation, there's a lot of space there for a lot of professionals to excel as long as they don't forget the simple soft skills and showing genuine interest in communication.
So what's the difference when you think about your time in the Marine Corps when you led squads and teams, and now you're leading, project teams, consulting teams? Where are they similar? Where's that different?
So there's a lot of similarities, and I think just in general, people are looking for sometimes guidance, some absolutes. What's the answer, right? So, in the military, there's a lot of regulation. Just a lot, Sometimes working with Microsoft, there's like a 150-page book on licensing structure. It's just like, man, that is some exciting stuff. But on the other side of that, it's so I see some similarities where people can sometimes be a little bit enchanted by their own bureaucracy and figure out ways, I would say, instead of solving for, they problem identify. Well, the regulation says, and this means no. The licensing says, or the deployment structure says, and this means no. Well, that's not why we're here. We're here to solve somebody else's problem, which means we have to solve for, right? So there's some similarities there where it's different, and this is probably the rebellious streak that I still hold on to these days, is I just always had this independent and critical thought, like, we'd be in formation, they give this long speech, and I'm thinking in my head, this does not make sense, and everybody's like, raw, and I'm like, no, what? And so it's the same thing sometimes in corporate environments. People get into the rah-rah mode, and you hear a lot of the business speak, and I'm like, no, wait a minute, what? Let's ask. There is a space, and again, I'm not a maverick because I want the attention, but I'm unafraid to ask sometimes harsh questions, professionally wrapped, don't get me wrong, but and there's a lot of people that are afraid of rocking the boat, and I won't say I don't care, but I don't think that's the purpose of why we're interacting, just to further extend a conversation. And I preface it by saying, look, I may ask a harsh question. You let me know if I'm sticking my beak where it doesn't belong. But here's what I'm hearing. here's what I'm also translating. Are we going down the right path? Because that's not the facilitation that I'm going through in this. Even in some of our presentations, I don't think we're aligned. Am I wrong?
So I want to go down that path a little bit further, because you modeled it for us really, really well. But there's this part of you that is just always true to who you are, which is this candid, want to speak the truth, not listen to bureaucracy or things that don't make sense. But then in all the environments you've been in, to certain degrees, varying degrees, there's a level of politics in those environments. And sometimes politics doesn't want to hear you kind of attend to the fact the emperor has no clothes. And you modeled it a little bit there, but for people that are living in that world, they say, gosh, I really want to be able to just be candid. I want to have candid, honest conversations. But I'm in a really big organization and I don't want to shoot myself in the foot by doing that. How do you navigate those waters?
Well, you have to be okay with taking some risk. And the key word there is risk and not gamble. So
just to unpack it, what's the difference?
Yeah, so a gamble means that you have a response and you have no idea where this is going to go.
You got the dice and you just throw it out there.
Yeah, somebody.
Like, let's see what I get.
Yeah, somebody just, there are a lot of signature authorities involved with the projects, but they're not necessarily involved with the actual integration or down to the day-to-day operations. So you have to kind of consider there's your point of view of the reason why you're there in a job, but then there's a lot of external influences. So you have to kind of zoom out of a problem a little bit, right, and understand that the further you're away from the actual solution, there's a lot of other external, when I say politics, it could be quarterlies, it could be from a budgetary standpoint, it could be this person just started this particular company and they've only been there for 3 or 4 months, so their risk, I would say quotient may be extremely low because they don't have a reputation yet just to put their neck out on some random project, right? So you have to just consider all of that. So, if you're going to ask a question or if you're going to be, the term is pushback, and I don't think a lot of people even understands what that means. They use it. It's like we use these colloquialisms almost when they had a definition and we've turned them into something else. But when you do push back or when you do ask challenging questions, then be prepared to recalibrate. A risk doesn't mean, you're never trying to lose the hand in one question. You're never trying to be so bold that you put everybody in the project at risk or whatever it is, the professional endeavor. You have to always, I would say, keep your team, keep yourself in the game. So if you make a misstep, then it was hopefully with the right intent that can be explained, and they can respect even mistakes sometimes if they understand your intent was professionally aligned to the whole reason why you're in the room to begin with. So I don't know if that probably was a little bit more diluted than a concise answer that you were looking for, but hopefully that gives you some context.
No, it's really good. So as you think back, this maybe is a little more, I don't know if this is a harder question or not, Robert, but let's see. So if you think back to your career, and you think back specifically to your leadership, not necessarily choices you made, could be, but it sounds like a lot of your story was, I want to go in this direction. They said, well, we've got this direction planned for you. You had different opportunities which opened up that maybe weren't the ones you anticipated. But when you think back to your career and your leadership, is there anything you wish you had done differently?
So I think, resilience, I talk about resilience often, right? Because I don't know that you can synthetically create, you can come up with a case study. I mean, you can get taste of it, right? But I don't think you understand it unless you've been through some trials and tribulations, right? So the downfall of that, I wish I would have realized this much earlier, is that resilience can also on the spectrum become hard-headedness, stubborn, unwilling to listen, to not be flexible. And so you have to really, have not only mentors, I think is extremely important. You have to have other sources beyond just the professional environment that you're in that will give you different perspectives. I would compare it to like driving on the road. sometimes, there are road signs that are helpful to give you, this is coming. Sometimes there are billboards that are just distracting information. And you got to have some type of between mentors and what I would consider a lifelong intellectual curiosity of learning that keeps you on the road, right? Those are your hands that keeps you on the road. So when you see a billboard, it's a billboard that's not it's useless. Or is this saying there's a warning sign coming up that maybe you can anticipate? But resilience is one of those things I'd be careful of, because what got you here, whatever it is, versus where you want to be, those can be some different requirements.
Yeah, I've also, if you think about like using MBA speak, managerial accounting, they talk about sunk costs. It's like I'm already in this for $1 million. I might as well keep on staying in it. Or I don't want to give up or feel like I'm giving up. So it's kind of learning when and how to pivot and the right timing of that.
Yeah, sometimes it's there's a fine line between pivot and recalibration and just re-engineering, right? Sometimes you have to kind of know, and I think to have range, and again, the more experience you have, I think I'm a big fan of reading, because when I say smart people, you read. Authors usually reference other authors, so you could say it's an endless opportunity to constantly learn from where other smart people respect other smart people, and I'm not saying they're shilling like in the back cover of somebody that's promoting a book, but somebody they actually reference as a source. I don't mind hearing qualified opinions. I don't know if I necessarily care as much for, what did so-and-so say on the street? Well, let's read his tweet. Well, that's great, but I don't understand what that really means, right? But constantly reading, it gives you range, it gives you reference, it gives you context. So I just think that's important because how do you know when to pull back? I mean, there are life circumstances, right, that can put your life in jeopardy with, when I say professional jeopardy, personal jeopardy, if you're not paying attention.
Yeah.
But you can't let life be the only teacher. You have to be very careful of trying to learn through other people's experience rather than saying the school of hard knocks is the only place I'm going to graduate from.
Yeah, that's so well said. So I'm going to move us towards my last kind of final question I love to ask. So on this podcast, Leadership Foundry, I always like to ask my guests, so what's one good tip or life hack you have for us for how we can become better leaders starting tomorrow? So when you think about leadership today, what do you see as like maybe a good gap that a tip or hack could really help a lot of leaders just get better at?
Well, let me give you a pragmatic. So I'm going to give you a little bit, and I won't say theory, some framework, and I want to give you also one that's more pragmatic. You have to learn how to turn it off. And what I mean by that is and I'm certainly very respectful of the neuroscience behind things, the gamification, the dopamine, if you will, manipulators. But if you think about it, just your phone alone, right? I'm one of those that if I see an alert, I have to. It's just, I feel like I'm shirking responsibility. I have to look at it. But if you're constantly reading emails all the time and turning the indicator off, and so the end answer is turn the indications off on your phone, on sometimes either by timing on text or just Outlook alone. Try the Outlook experiment alone, because then you're not drawn to pick up your phone. Then you're not drawn to read an email maybe late at night and respond, that it starts to become, you're encouraging others to probably not rest like they should. And you're thinking of something like speed doesn't always mean the best answer. So sometimes you just have to step away from it, from the problem in itself. So I would suggest that people consider turning off their Outlook indicators that show however many emails they've received, because it's still going to be there. You can still take that action. You just don't have that visual indication, and maybe it creates a little bit less anxiety. Maybe it gives you a little bit more mental faculty to have focus and being in the moment of the conversation that you're in rather than already moving on to something else. The other part that I would say is a little bit of framework is, there's this, the reference to the 40-hour work week, and I know people are talking about it shortening here or there, but I don't really believe we've ever had an effective, unless depending on the industry, you've ever had an effective 40-hour work week to begin with. And I think if you can really focus on understanding that you really only have maybe 3.5 effective days of getting work done, not 5, because anybody that's setting an appointment at Friday at 4 o'clock, you might get acceptance, but you're not getting very far, just generally speaking, because people are on fumes at that point. They've already checked out a little bit mentally. You're occupying space on somebody's calendar. You feel like maybe you're accomplishing something, but you're not as efficient as maybe you think you are.
Yeah.
So I would look at, again, trying to front load. And again, this is framework. Everybody has to test it out according to their industry. Look at Monday afternoon till about Thursday at noon as being your front loaded of everything that you wanted to accomplish in that week. Try to do it within that time frame. Monday morning is tough because people are just gearing up for the week. And as much as we talk about preparing for the next week, it doesn't always work out that way. I would reserve Friday for any of your admin, if you could, training, professional development, and then for deep focus and deep thinking, right? Because if we're never analyzing our own performance, there's never a space and time for you to actually observe and look at your own outcomes, if you will. How do you get better? It's almost like you're treading water and expecting to go in a different direction. So there's 2 that I would recommend.
I love how they're paired together too. You've got one that's about setting boundaries so you can properly refocus, maybe even do some deep thinking, but also just not be completely inundated constantly with noise and creating unnecessary pace. And then the other one's smart. What's the optimal time for the most impact? Like that kind of Monday through Thursday noon.
Right.
Awesome. Man, this was a great conversation. I loved all the nuggets in here. So, Robert, if people want to learn more about you or follow you, where can they go?
Yes, so LinkedIn, I'm there. I'm willing to connect with anyone. I don't have this bar of if I don't know you in the second or third connection. So glad to connect, glad to share, because I think it's my attempt at if you will, of giving back. So if anybody has questions, glad to share hopefully some bits of information. And then there's our company website, Sikich.com, Sikich.com, where you could find my profile and then learn a little bit more about our company.
Fantastic. This is great, man. I really appreciate it. Thanks for being willing to share your story, but also, most importantly, all those practical tips. I took a whole page of notes. I know everyone listening got at least one nugget from it.
Yeah.
So thanks for spending some time with us today.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. I'm honored to be here.
I really loved my conversation with Robert. I've had the opportunity and the privilege to spend time with him before. And what I love about his story is it really is a story of resilience. Robert, throughout his career and life, has been dealt different hands than what he thought he was going to be dealt, and he had to navigate through that. And as he reminds us, he says, resetting in life is hard. And it seems like this is a pattern in a lot of our shows this month, this pattern of resilience, and also this pattern of using curiosity as a tool to navigate through some of those things. And he even talked about that. But I really want to focus on a few key points that he gave us as leadership lessons. So first, he said, recognize what you don't know and don't be afraid of it. Really look at it and plan for it. Robert, if you didn't pick up on this, is a very planful guy. He likes to read a lot, learn from others. So he reminds us to plan, and that's kind of the difference between smart risk-taking and gambling. So he thinks through things and plans. He also said, as a leader, people are looking for guidance. So find ways to articulate your focus or intent for them, whether it's a client or a team. And he said that's very similar, whether it was the Marine Corps or a consulting team or even clients he's dealing with today. And then he tells us when you're going to push back. I asked him a lot about pushing back because that's so much in his character, and yet he's been in very political places. He says, when you're going to push back, just be prepared to recalibrate. So what he's reminding us there is push back respectfully, but also don't be afraid if the person doesn't give you what you want or tells you something different than what you expected to hear, and learn how to make those adjustments. Be open to that versus rigid. And speaking of rigid, his final key point for us and final key point for takeaway for today is he said, sometimes while resilience is a strength, it can get overplayed. He said, if you go on the continuum, on the far end, you can become hard-headed, stubborn, and maybe even rigid because you're just trying to push through on something that maybe it's time for you to transition into something else or try a different approach rather than just, using a good baseball analogy, throw harder. So I love the conversation with Robert. I hope you took away something. And in fact, that really is the goal of all these Leadership Foundry podcasts, is for you to take away one thing to make you a better leader starting tomorrow.